He stood up in the middle of the graduation dinner wine glass already in his hand. My older brother, Evan Miller. The table was full, family on both sides. A long table under warm lights at a seafood restaurant along the Charleston Harbor. Plates half cleared, glasses refilled, the kind of night meant to feel safe. Evan raised his glass like he was about to make a proper toast. People leaned in. Someone smiled, expecting praise. He started with his son's name. One sentence. Then his eyes shifted. Not to me. To my daughter, Lena. "Let's be honest," he said, voice calm, steady, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That kid of yours, she's never going to be anything. Just another useless mouth to feed." The words landed clean. No shouting, no stumble, no mistake. For a second, nothing moved. Then someone at the far end let out a short laugh and cut it off too late. My mother reached across the table and closed her hand around my wrist, fingers firm, urgent. "Don't. Not here." My father lowered his eyes and stared at his plate completely still. No one spoke. No one corrected him. No one said her name. I didn't look at Evan. I didn't respond. I turned to Lena. She hadn't moved. Her back was straight, hands folded in her lap, fingers pressed together so tightly the knuckles were pale. Her eyes stayed on the table, fixed on a spot between the silverware and the candle. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just went very still. I felt my jaw tighten. I swallowed once and tasted metal. The room felt smaller than it had a moment before, like the air had been pulled out slowly and no one noticed. Evan lowered his glass and sat back down satisfied. The conversation tried to restart. Someone reached for a menu. A chair scraped softly against the floor. Life moved forward as if nothing irreversible had just been said. That was when it hit me, not the cruelty of his words, but how easily they were allowed to exist. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need support. The silence around him did the work. And in that silence, I understood something I hadn't before. There are insults that hurt, and then there are insults that survive because everyone else lets them. The drive home was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. The road along the harbor gave way to darker streets, the restaurant lights shrinking in the rearview mirror until they disappeared. Lena sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, shoulders set, staring straight ahead. She didn't cry. She didn't ask to turn on the radio. The dashboard lights cast a faint blue glow across her face, catching on her eyelashes when she blinked. I kept my eyes on the road, but I watched her reflection in the glass more than the traffic. Silence like that doesn't feel empty. It feels deliberate. I slowed as we turned into our street. The tires whispered over the pavement. When I pulled into the driveway, I cut the engine but stayed seated, both hands resting on the steering wheel. The garage door rose with its familiar rattle, then closed behind us with a dull final thud. The overhead light flicked on, then off again when the motion sensor timed out, leaving us in the dim wash from the car's interior. Neither of us reached for the door handle. The air felt heavier there contained. I took a breath and let it out slowly, careful not to rush her. That was when Lena turned toward me. Her voice was steady, almost practiced, like she had rehearsed the words in her head before letting them out. "Mom," she said, and paused just long enough to matter. "If Uncle Evan says it in front of everyone, is it true?" She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked like someone trying to understand a rule she hadn't been told existed. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel before I noticed I was doing it. I swallowed once, feeling the question settle somewhere low and sharp. I reached across the console and rested my hand on her knee, not squeezing, just making contact. She didn't pull away. The garage smelled faintly of oil and cardboard. Ordinary things unchanged by what had just happened. I realized then that the damage wasn't in the words alone. It was in the permission those words were given. A child shouldn't have to wonder whether silence means agreement. Sitting there with the engine ticking as it cooled, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. If I stayed quiet again, if I smoothed this over the way I always had, I wouldn't be protecting the peace. I would be teaching my daughter that this was the cost of belonging. And that was a lesson I could not afford to pass on. But before I tell you what I did next, like subscribe and comment where you're watching from, I didn't answer Lena's question right away. That night after she went to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint tick of the wall clock. The house had settled the way it always does after midnight, every sound sharper because nothing competes with it. I rinsed a single mug and set it in the drying rack, lining it up carefully with the others. My hands were steady. My thoughts were not. What she asked in the garage didn't come out of nowhere. It had been forming for years, long before she was old enough to put words to it. I'm Rachel Moore. I'm 38 years old. I run a mid-sized logistics operation that coordinates regional freight, nothing flashy but reliable. Schedules, contracts, margins. I built it piece by piece while raising a child on my own. I don't talk about it much at family gatherings. I learned early that competence attracts requests, not protection. From the outside, I was always the one who had it handled. Inside, I was just doing what needed to be done because no one else would. Growing up, I was the easy one. That's what they said. I didn't need reminders. I didn't miss curfews. I didn't ask for money unless it was necessary, and even then, I usually found a way around it. Teachers praised me for being mature. Relatives nodded approvingly when my name came up. Rachel doesn't need much, my mother would say, like it was a compliment. I believed her. I learned to pack my own lunches, solve my own problems, sit quietly when things got uncomfortable. Being low maintenance felt like survival. Evan was different. My older brother failed loudly and often. He dropped classes, changed majors, started businesses that collapsed before the paperwork dried. There were cars he couldn't afford, apartments he didn't keep, debts that appeared suddenly and needed to be handled immediately. Each time the family rallied, excuses were made. He's under a lot of pressure. He just needs time. He's sensitive. Money moved quietly from one place to another. Consequences were postponed. Someone always stepped in before things got real. I watched it happen from the sidelines, hands folded, saying nothing. When Evan stumbled, the room filled with concern. When I succeeded, the room moved on. It wasn't resentment at first. It was something duller, an understanding that my role was to absorb weight, not receive it. If Evan needed help, he got it. If I needed space, I took it without asking. That pattern hardened over time until it stopped feeling like a pattern and started feeling like gravity. By the time I was an adult, the label had stuck. Rachel's the dependable one. They said it with pride, with relief. Like a safety net they didn't have to look at too closely. Dependable meant I'd show up early and leave last. It meant I'd fill gaps without being asked and smooth things over before they became scenes. It meant no one worried about me because worrying requires imagining someone might fall. I didn't fall. I adjusted. When I became a single mother, the label followed me. She's strong. She'll manage. Offers of help came wrapped in assumptions. I learned to say thank you and decline before anyone could feel inconvenienced. Evan's life, meanwhile, stayed complicated. Each new setback arrived with urgency, and each rescue reinforced the same lesson: failure earned attention. Stability earned silence. Standing there in my dark kitchen, I pressed my palm flat against the counter and felt the cool surface ground me. I understood then that dependable wasn't praise. It was a system. A way to explain why no one stepped in when lines were crossed, why certain words were allowed to linger in the air. Dependable meant I could take it. It meant I didn't need defending. It meant the family could look away and tell themselves everything was balanced. That night at the restaurant didn't create this imbalance. It exposed it. Evan said what he said because he knew he could. The room stayed quiet because it always had. And when Lena asked me if it was true, she wasn't just asking about herself. She was asking whether this family would ever stand up for her, or if being strong meant learning to carry the weight alone the way I always had. I didn't sleep much after that night. What I carried from the kitchen followed me into the days that came after, quiet but persistent. It reminded me of when this pattern truly set itself in motion, when being dependable stopped being a description and became an obligation. That memory came back to me with unusual clarity, not because it was dramatic, but because it arrived without warning, the way real turning points often do. It was a little over 5 years ago when my father had his stroke. Not a collapse, not the kind people talk about in hushed voices, but enough to put him in a hospital bed with wires on his chest and a monitor that never quite stopped beeping. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. The lights in the hallway stayed too bright even at night. I visited after work, standing at the foot of the bed while he slept, listening to the slow mechanical rhythm that kept track of his heart for us. No one said much. We didn't need to. That same night, close to midnight, my mother came to my house. I remember because I hadn't turned off the porch light yet, and it cast a pale yellow circle over her as she stood there, smaller than usual, shoulders slumped. She didn't knock right away. When she finally did, it was light, almost hesitant. I let her in without asking questions. She sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched, eyes red but dry. The clock above the sink read 12:17 a.m. She didn't start with my father. She started with Evan. She told me his house payment was behind, that the bank had sent another notice, that the kids' private school tuition was coming due, and there was no way they could cover it. Her voice stayed even careful, as if she were listing groceries. She said his name over and over, like repetition might soften what she was asking. I stood at the counter, leaning my hip against the edge, listening. The refrigerator kicked on and off behind me. The house felt very still. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "You're stronger," she told me, finally looking up. "You can handle more. Evan, he can't take another failure." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She said it the way someone explains weather, as a fact. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't interrupt her. She went on. If the school wasn't paid, the kids would be asked to leave. If the mortgage wasn't caught up, the bank would move forward. Evan was already overwhelmed. This would break him. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, a familiar gesture meant to reassure. "Just this once," she said. "Help him get through this." I remember nodding slowly. I remember saying I'd think about it. What I didn't say was that I already knew the answer. Strong people don't get asked if they want to carry the weight. It's assumed they will. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I agreed. I told myself I was helping the children, that I was protecting my father while he recovered, that it was temporary. I didn't give Evan cash. I paid the tuition directly. I wired the money straight to the school. I contacted the bank and covered the overdue amount to stop the foreclosure clock. I kept everything clean, documented, controlled. I told myself that was the boundary. My mother hugged me before she left, holding on a second longer than usual. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she said. I stood in the doorway, watching her walk back into the night, the porch light clicking off behind her. The house went quiet again. I rinsed the mug she hadn't used and set it in the sink. My hands didn't shake. That was the moment the rules changed. No announcement, no discussion, just a quiet shift. From that night on, helping wasn't a choice I made, it was something expected. The school payments didn't stop after that semester. The house didn't stabilize on its own. The requests kept coming, each one framed as urgent, reasonable, unavoidable. And every time I said yes, the silence around Evan's behavior grew thicker. I didn't realize it then, but I had stepped into a role I wouldn't be allowed to leave without consequences. And by agreeing just this once, I had unknowingly taught everyone exactly who would absorb the damage when things went wrong. After that first payment, nothing snapped back into place the way I told myself it would. The emergency never ended. It just changed shape. Tuition became a standing obligation, due dates circling my calendar in red. A monthly transfer followed, always framed as temporary, always justified by timing. I set it up to run automatically on the first of each month, a quiet withdrawal that happened while I slept. Later came the credit card for emergencies, my mother said, so Evan wouldn't have to feel embarrassed asking again. I added his name, closed the laptop, and told myself this was still under control. The money moved smoothly, too smoothly. It left my accounts and landed exactly where it was meant to, and no one ever talked about it again. There were no thank yous, no check-ins, no acknowledgement that something unusual was happening. Family dinners stayed polite. Conversations stayed shallow. The help became part of the background, like lighting or music, noticed only if it disappeared. I kept my receipts and confirmations in a folder I rarely opened because looking too closely made my chest tighten. I learned not to count. Counting makes things real. What did become real were the comments. They arrived casually, often, with a smile, often in front of other people. At a birthday gathering, someone asked Lena about school and tilted their head when she answered. "She's more creative," Evan said, lightly stepping in. "Not really the academic type." Another time he laughed and said she reminded him of himself at that age, easily distracted, not focused on what mattered. I watched Lena's shoulders draw in, watched her nod like she agreed. I kept my face neutral and reached for my glass. It happened again at a barbecue the following summer. Smoke hung low over the yard and paper plates sagged under food. Evan's kids ran past loud and confident, and someone praised their grades. Evan beamed. "They're driven," he said. "They know how to work." Then he looked at Lena sitting cross-legged on the steps with a sketchbook in her lap. "She's got a good imagination," he added almost kindly. "Just needs to learn how to apply herself." I felt my fingers curl into my palm. I unfolded them slowly and kept my hands still. No one corrected him. No one said her name with the same certainty they said his children's. The labels stuck because they were repeated, not focused, easily overwhelmed. Probably won't go far. Each one landed quietly and stayed. Lena stopped volunteering answers at the table. She stopped bringing her drawings to show anyone. I noticed the way she checked my face before speaking, as if asking permission to take up space. I answered her with a nod every time, careful not to rush her, careful not to show what it cost me. The irony was never spoken out loud. Evan's life looked increasingly polished. New clothes appeared, his house stayed intact. His kids remained enrolled, their schedules full of activities that required fees I paid directly. He talked about their opportunities as if they had materialized on their own. I listened, breathing slow, while my phone buzzed with bank alerts I ignored. Stability, it turned out, is convincing when it's funded quietly. The night of the graduation dinner came after years of this. Long table, warm lights, plates cleared. Evan stood to speak, proud and relaxed, listing his son's accomplishments. Scholarships mentioned. Doors opening. Applause followed. I sat still and watched the candle flame bend with the air conditioning. Lena sat beside me, hands folded, eyes down. When Evan finished, someone said how lucky his kids were. He smiled and agreed. I felt something settle then, not anger, not surprise, but recognition. The success he was celebrating had a ledger. It had dates and amounts and confirmations. It had my name on it. The room didn't know that. Lena didn't know that. Evan certainly didn't acknowledge it. He spoke as if the ground beneath him were solid by nature, not supported. As the conversation moved on, I realized the sharpest part wasn't the money leaving my accounts. It was watching my daughter absorb the consequences of generosity she didn't benefit from. I had paid to keep the peace, and in doing so, I had financed the story that placed her below everyone else at the table. And sitting there listening to applause that rested on my silence, I understood the final cruelty. I wasn't just supporting Evan's family, I was underwriting the permission to call my child less. I didn't bring the night with me when I got home from that dinner. It followed on its own. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a long day when nothing else is scheduled to happen. Lena was asleep. Her door was cracked just enough to let the hall light spill across the floor. I stood there for a moment, listening to her breathing, counting it without meaning to. Then I closed my door and went to the small desk by the window, the one I used for things I didn't want to leave half finished. I opened my laptop and waited for it to wake up. The screen lit my hands from below, pale and flat, like they belonged to someone else. Outside, the street was still. A porch light flickered across the road. Somewhere, a dog barked once and stopped. I didn't turn on any other lights. I didn't need them. I clicked into the folder I had labeled years earlier and never renamed. Family support. Neutral words. Administrative words. Words that kept emotion out of it. The spreadsheet loaded slowly. Rows and columns appeared familiar and clean. Dates on the left. Descriptions in the middle. Amounts aligned to the right, all formatted the same way. Tuition payments. Monthly transfers. One-time wires. Credit card charges labeled school, medical, housing. I scrolled without rushing, the trackpad cool under my finger. I wasn't looking for anything new. I was looking for the end. I stopped when the totals came into view. The number sat there, unembellished, not bolded or highlighted, just a figure with commas placed exactly where they should be. Over $600,000. I read it once, then again. My eyes didn't blur, my hands didn't shake. I rested my palms flat on the desk and let the chair take my weight. The hum of the computer fan filled the room. I noticed the sound because nothing else competed with it. I didn't cry. There was nothing left in me that could do that on command. I thought about the hours I'd worked late, the contracts I'd renegotiated, the vacations I'd postponed without mentioning them. I thought about how careful I'd been, paying directly, documenting everything, keeping it clean. This wasn't chaos, it was maintenance. And maintenance, I realized, is expensive when you're the only one doing it. I scrolled back up slower this time and let specific entries settle in my mind. The semester when Evan's kids nearly had to leave their school. The month the mortgage notice came with red lettering. The stretch when just until next quarter turned into a standing order. Each line corresponded to a moment I remembered smoothing over, explaining away, absorbing. None of them included the comments at the table. None of them accounted for the looks Lena learned to recognize. The screen reflected in the dark window beside me. My face looked calm there, older than I felt, composed in a way I'd practiced. I took a breath and held it for a count of 3, then let it out. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. Anger would have been easier to place. What I felt instead was clarity, clean and unarguable. Numbers have that effect. They don't ask for interpretation. They don't soften themselves for family. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured the dinner table again, the applause, the pride, the way Evan spoke as if success had appeared by merit alone. I pictured Lena's hands folded in her lap, the way she went still when words landed too close. The connection settled into place without effort. The money didn't just keep Evan afloat. It created the stage he stood on. It paid for the comfort that allowed his voice to carry. When I opened my eyes, the spreadsheet was still there, unchanged. I didn't minimize it. I didn't close it. I read the total one last time and nodded once to no one. The realization didn't arrive like a wave. It came like a sentence you finally finish reading after skipping it for years. I wasn't helping my family. I wasn't keeping the peace. I was funding the conditions that made it acceptable to look at my daughter and call her less. That was the point where the story shifted. Not because anything outside me changed, but because something inside me stopped pretending. The numbers didn't accuse. They simply stated what had been true all along. And sitting there in the quiet lit only by the screen, I understood the final cost I had been paying steadily and without protest for the right of others to diminish my child. I didn't close the spreadsheet right away. I sat there a moment longer, letting the glow from the screen steady me like a horizon line you fix your eyes on to keep from drifting. The number didn't change. It didn't argue. It simply existed. When I finally moved, it wasn't with urgency. It was with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years, the calm that comes when a decision has already been made and the body just needs to catch up. I opened my email first. The house was still the only sound, the low hum of the laptop and the distant click of the heater cycling on. I typed the address for the private school from memory. I'd written to them often enough. The subject line was plain and final: termination of tuition sponsorship. No punctuation beyond what was necessary. In the body, I kept it professional. I identified myself. I stated that I would no longer be financially responsible for Evan's children, effective immediately. I asked that all future billing be directed to their parents. I read it once, then again, checking for errors the way I would with a contract. I didn't add an explanation. I didn't soften the language. When I clicked send, the small sound the computer made felt louder than it should have. That was the first cut. Next were the transfers. I logged into my bank account and navigated to the scheduled payments, a familiar path I could follow without looking. The monthly amount sat there, labeled neatly recurring on the first. I selected it and clicked cancel. A box appeared asking me to confirm. I didn't hesitate. I clicked yes and watched the line disappear. The screen refreshed, leaving empty space where something permanent had been. I exhaled slowly and noticed my shoulders drop just a fraction. That was the second cut. The credit card took longer. I had added Evan as an authorized user years earlier, telling myself it was for emergencies, for convenience, for dignity. I found his name under account settings and paused with the cursor hovering over it. The kitchen clock ticked steadily behind me, counting off seconds I no longer felt pressured by. I clicked remove. Another confirmation, another yes. The system processed the change without ceremony. Access revoked, no alert sent, no warnings issued. I imagined the next swipe, the brief confusion, the quiet decline. That was the third cut. I moved on to the auto payments, insurance premiums, utility balances, a few subscriptions tied to addresses that weren't mine. Each one required the same steps: click, edit, remove payment method, save. The repetition was almost meditative. My fingers didn't shake. My jaw stayed relaxed. I kept my breathing, even aware of the way the chair supported my back, the way the desk edge pressed lightly into my forearms. This wasn't anger. It was alignment. Each change brought my actions closer to what I knew to be true. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text my mother or leave a message for Evan. I didn't explain myself to a person who had already benefited from years of explanation. I understood something clearly. Then advance notice would have turned this into a negotiation. It would have invited promises, apologies, urgency. Silence, on the other hand, would let reality arrive on its own terms. I chose silence. It took less than 20 minutes to dismantle what had taken years to build. When I closed the laptop, the room felt different, as if something heavy had been moved out while no one was looking. I waited for guilt. I waited for panic, for second thoughts, for the reflex to undo what I'd just done. None of it came. What I felt instead was space, a widening, quiet space where obligation used to sit. I stood and rinsed my mug, setting it upside down on the rack. The water ran clear, the sink drained without resistance, ordinary motions unchanged by the fact that entire lives were about to be disrupted. I turned off the light and walked down the hall, pausing outside Lena's room. She slept on her side, one hand curled near her face, breathing slow and even. I didn't wake her. There was nothing to say yet. The consequences didn't arrive that night. They didn't need to. Systems like the one I'd been supporting don't collapse loudly at first. They fail in small, precise ways. An invoice redirected. A payment declined. A service paused. I knew the timeline because I'd been managing it. I knew how quickly things would unravel without the quiet support holding them together. That knowledge didn't frighten me. It grounded me. I went to bed and slept straight through until morning, something I hadn't done in a long time. When I woke, the house was filled with early light, pale and steady. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. The day waited unremarkable, and mine. Somewhere across town, the machinery I had been powering would begin to sputter, then stall. Calls would be made, confusion would set in, explanations would be demanded. I didn't prepare a response, I didn't rehearse a defense. I understood that the work was already done. By choosing not to warn them, not to justify myself, I had allowed the truth to arrive without my fingerprints on it. The support was gone. The stage was empty. And for the first time, the weight I had been carrying belonged where it always should have, on the people who had mistaken my silence for permission. The first call came the next morning while I was pouring coffee. The kettle clicked off on its own steam, lifting into the quiet kitchen. My phone vibrated against the counter, the sound sharp in the stillness. Evan's name filled the screen. I watched it ring once, twice before answering. His voice came through strained and fast words stepping on each other. Something about the school, about a payment that hadn't gone through, about a mistake that needed fixing. I listened without interrupting, eyes on the thin line of coffee creeping toward the rim of the mug. When he paused to breathe, I said nothing. The silence stretched, and I could hear his panic settling in. That was the moment he realized I wasn't going to rescue him. By noon, my parents were at my door. Their car pulled into the driveway, two hard tires crunching against the gravel. My mother knocked without waiting, her knuckles tight and impatient. My father stood behind her shoulders, drawn in, eyes already tired. They moved through the house like they owned it, voices rising before coats were even off. Words came quickly, family obligation over reaction. My mother's face was flushed, her hands shaking as she spoke. My father stared at the floor, saying little, but his silence pressed just as hard. I stood near the kitchen sink, hands resting on the counter, listening until the noise burned itself out. "You can't just cut them off," my mother said finally. "Do you know what you've done?" I met her eyes and answered with one sentence, steady and clear. I stopped paying for disrespect. The room went quiet. Not shocked quiet. Exposed quiet. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under him. No one argued with the words themselves. They argued with the timing, the tone, the consequence, but not the truth of them. When they left, my mother cried softly, and my father didn't look back. I closed the door and stood there a moment longer, hand on the handle, breathing in the familiar smell of my own house. It felt intact, untouched. The fallout unfolded the way I knew it would. Evan's calls grew more desperate, then angry, then sporadic. Without tuition covered, the school demanded payment in full. Without monthly transfers, the balance never stabilized. The credit card declined quietly, then repeatedly. Things he had treated as permanent revealed themselves as borrowed. I heard pieces through other people filtered and incomplete. The house went first, then the car he liked to show off disappeared from the driveway. Conversations that once carried pride shifted to explanations. His world shrank to what he could actually hold on his own. Lena noticed the change before I said anything, not in the headlines, but in herself. She started leaving her door open again. She asked to show me her drawings without checking my face first. One afternoon, she sat at the table and worked in silence, pencil moving, steadily erasing and correcting without frustration. I watched from the stove, the smell of dinner filling the room, and saw her shoulders relax in a way they hadn't for years. She wasn't lighter because Evan had fallen. She was lighter because the weight had been removed from her. Weeks passed, then months. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. Family gatherings stopped coming with strings attached. Invitations thinned. I didn't chase them. Lena joined a small art program at school, tentative at first, then confident. She laughed more easily. She stood taller. One evening, she told me she wanted to apply for a summer workshop she'd found on her own. I nodded and said we'd look at it together. The way she smiled then stayed with me. I didn't celebrate Evan's losses. I didn't need to. What mattered was what grew in the space his entitlement left behind. My home felt calmer. My work felt focused. I slept through the night. When I thought about the past, it no longer felt like something unfinished. It felt resolved. Not clean, not painless, but honest. Choosing my child over false harmony cost me a version of family I had already outgrown. What it gave me was quieter, sturdier, and real. I learned that loyalty without respect is just another form of silence. And no family, no matter how close by blood, is worth preserving if the price is teaching your child to stand smaller than they are.